Good morning, everybody. Today I want to talk to you a little bit about one of our focus psalms, and that would be Psalm 45, which is another royal psalm. Now, there's interesting things to be considered, especially with the royal psalms, because some of these play into later ideas of messianic hope. This particular one is very specific in several details, and I wanted to just mention a few of them according to the topics we've been looking at in class to reinforce a few of the comments that have already been made. First of all, the topics I wanted to talk about are three. First of all is the idea of superscriptions. The second is the idea of metaphor, and the third is the idea of parallelism. And this proves to be a really interesting psalm because, number one, it does have a superscription. Number two, it has some metaphor. And number three, it has some interesting features regarding parallelism that we could go on and on talking about. But I want to point out something that's happening here in this particular psalm in the English translations. So let's look at the idea of the superscription. In our text world theory, world builder kind of idea, we discover here that a superscription is a very useful part of the psalm. And even though superscriptions tend to have been added later, according to most scholars nowadays, probably the reason that they are there is to provide some context because they help to build out the text world. Ideas that may or may not be in the text themselves can be made explicit with the idea of the superscription. And I did get one interesting question in our course question forum last week about the numbering of psalms. And I would say probably at least a third of them are numbered differently in English than they are in Hebrew. And this number one results in some interesting ideas when you try to go compare texts between Hebrew text and English text. And number two, it shows something about the Hebrew understanding of these superscriptions because they actually are given a number. So for some of these, it'll be verse number 1. For a couple of them, it's verse number 1 and verse number 2. And I found even another one that's verses number 1 through 3 in the Hebrew. Whereas in the English translations, we start numbering the verses at 1 after the superscription. So this sort of lets you know that different traditions are looking at these in a little bit different way by either including them as part of the numbering system or not. And again, this is not a concrete kind of thing we can argue for, but it does show that there is some difference. And also, if you find yourself reading a commentary, particularly I believe the Word Biblical Commentary will use the Hebrew numbering system, and you're looking at your English going, wait a minute, that's off a bit. Understand it's merely a matter of keeping track. It's not really a matter of things actually being different. It's that they're numbered differently. So this particular psalm is numbered in the Hebrew. Number 1 is the superscription. Verse 2 would be what we see as number 1, and so forth all the way down the line, which makes, of course, discussion interesting. The superscription here tells you a few things. Number 1, it was for the director of music. Number 2, there's a tune known in that day called Lilies. Number 3, the authorship here is attributed to the sons of Korah. So we've skipped out of the Davidic part of the first book of Psalms here, and now we're into something here where we're going to get the sons of Korah and other purported authors. It's labeled as a maskil, something we could talk about later. And also we have a clue here in that it's a wedding song. So if we look at the text world categories of time, location, characters, and objects for this particular psalm, it shows a few interesting things. Number 1, that we have the idea that there's a wedding involved. Whether or not it's a specific wedding, it is a royal wedding. So here we have some setup for what might have taken place in a royal wedding. There is one location mentioned in here, and that is, actually there's two. We have the idea of the city of Tyre is mentioned, and also the royal bride coming in the gold of Ophir. This doesn't tell us where the psalm was written. It merely places it a little bit more firmly in the ancient Near East. Our characters are somewhat interesting. I've mentioned the sons of Korah. We have the psalmist speaking. We have mention of God. And then we have these other sorts of addressees, you mighty one. We have the daughter. We have the princess. and her virgin companions. So it becomes quite clear after reading the psalm that we've got 2 or 3 different main characters who have some different titles within the psalm itself. But we start with God and the psalmist describing a wedding of a king and his bride. Okay, so we have the idea of the royal bride there. Now, I found some really interesting things. I like to make a list of objects as I'm looking through, because the objects often provide the backbone for metaphor and metonymy and other kinds of figures of speech that you might find. So I found in this particular one, just going through rather quickly, the idea of the sword, which can be used as a metaphorically for the, or metonymically, pardon me, for the idea of warfare. We have the cause of righteousness and so forth, which sounds a little bit like a superhero. We have sharp arrows. We have the throne of God. We have the scepter in verse 6. So make a note of that one. That one becomes very important. We have the oil of joy, mention of some beautiful smelling things, myrrh, aloes, and cassia, and beautiful places, a palace decorated with ivory. We also have the oral sort of thing here of the music of strings. So we get this opulent sort of characteristic of what's being built for this text world throughout the psalm is something of a royal and very beautiful place to be. Okay, so the very first verse numbered in English here, we have the psalmist declaring that his tongue is the pen of a, what does he say? A pen of a skillful writer here. And here we do have an actual literary metaphor. And here we have the comparison of the psalmist's literal tongue or speech being compared to the pen of a writer. And it's straight up metaphor, my tongue is X. And so we have a comparison here between the spoken word and the written word. And it's kind of a nice one. It sounds like his words are actually going to be something of enduring value. So verses 2 through 8, the psalmist is addressing the king. Okay, and even in verse 6, which is quite an interesting one, where he says, "Your throne, O God, will last forever and ever. A scepter of justice will be the scepter of your kingdom." This, in one of the notes in accordance, is the idea of the king being addressed as God's representative. So in this, we have this sort of merge of king and deity, where the king is looked upon as being the representative of God before the people. So he's in a very exalted sort of place even here. So keep verse 6 in mind, 7 in the Hebrew, for a moment, because we're going to go back to that. But actually, we could stay here for a moment. The scepter of justice. Okay, the scepter there is being used metonymically for the idea of rule or reign. So if someone has a scepter in their hand, that means they have the authority to rule and reign. And here the psalmist is really giving this king a high, not praise, but a high task, because he's saying your reign will be one of justice. So a rule marked with justice, but all packed in there in the idea of the scepter. Verses 9 through 15, the psalmist addresses the bride. The bride is not addressed in quite such, she is in a way addressed in sort of fancy terms, but he addresses her as daughter. Now, this is definitely, in our modern kind of view, a little bit of a, in a sense, kind of almost a put down kind of idea, daughter or princess to the king, as being the king, but it sort of puts her in a lower, slightly lower place than he does for the actual king. So that's an interesting thing. And it makes me wonder if after she's married, will they call her the queen, right? So there's something in there to be thought about. Now, verses 16 and 17, the psalmist seems to be addressing God in a way. Your sons will take the place of your fathers. In other words, almost with the voice of God. Your sons will take the place of your fathers. You will make them princes throughout the land. I will perpetuate your memory throughout all generations. Therefore, the nations will praise you forever and ever. So here we have a sort of forward-looking future promise for the role of the king and the reign of the king being passed on from generation to generation. Okay, so it's entirely possible that this is looking at Davidic kingship, but it's interesting that it doesn't mention David here. It mentions only the sons of Korah, right? So this is quite a fancy wedding sort of psalm. The interesting thing here, aside from the instances of metaphor and metonymy that I've just shared with you, is the idea of parallelism. It would appear, if I'm reading, for example, in the NIV version here, at verse 3, 4, and 5. Okay, so verse 3, gird your sword on your side, you mighty one, clothe yourself with splendor and majesty. In your majesty ride forth victoriously in the cause of truth, humility, and justice. There's the sort of superhero sounding phrase there, very high-flown language. Let your hand achieve awesome deeds. Let your sharp arrows pierce the hearts of the king's enemies. Let the nations fall beneath your feet. And here is our next very strong statement. Your throne, O God, will last forever and ever. A scepter of justice will be the scepter of your kingdom. Now, what's really interesting here is when I went back in thinking, I've got synonymous parallelism. Girding your sword and clothing yourself sound completely parallel. Well, the interesting thing is that there is no verb for clothe yourself. There is the imperative masculine singular direct address with the instruction to gird your sword, but the understanding there of clothing yourself is actually something that's sort of brought in the translation, so we don't have strict grammatical parallelism there. Okay, so I was slightly disappointed when I found that by looking back in the Hebrew. I thought, oh my goodness, my English translation makes it sound quite parallel when in actuality it's not quite that straightforward. Now at verse 4 in English, ride forth is again a strong imperative verb. So that one actually does sort of parallel with the idea of girding your sword and riding forth. Those two ideas begin to be a little bit more like their longer sentence type parallelism. But then the really interesting thing is the places here in my English translations where it says, let your right hand, let your sharp arrows, let the nations fall, in a triplet of lovely parallel sort of instructions, again, in the Hebrew is not such a nice, tidy triplet, although it's been brought to the English as this sort of triplet idea. Okay, the interesting thing is here, and this is grammatical for you, is that the right hand is actually being referred to as something that will be taught. So let your hand be taught. And that comes across in the jussive voice in the Hebrew. Let the sharp arrows is not in a jussive form. In fact, it's a participle. Okay, so that's not exactly as parallel as it would be made to seem here. But the nations falling is another jussive form, another calimperative masculine plural jussive. Let the nations fall at your feet. And so two of them, the let your right hand and let the nations, are actually in this grammatical jussive volition of the psalmist saying, let this happen. May it happen. And the third one, the one in the middle, not so much, but they brought it forward in the same sort of tone here. This list here is actually something that we could talk about in text world terms because it actually has gone into a different type of modality. So when you have this particular type of verbal form, you actually have somebody's will being expressed. So it's not just a typical sentence, it's not a declarative sentence, but it more comes into this idea of may it be so that your right hand does this, and may it be so that the nations fall at your feet. And in other words, not quite a prayer, but moving in that direction. So I found this to be really interesting. In my disappointment, I was really enthusiastic because the whole thing does end up with that really good phrase, your throne, O God, will last forever and ever. Now, the interesting thing here for us as Christian interpreters that we can move on to, just to kind of make that connection, is the fact that this phrase, 45:7, is quoted rather frequently in other places. Psalm 33:5, Psalm 2:2 has something to do with this idea of the throne of God. But if you look at Hebrews 1 Hebrews 8 and 9, we have this being attributed as a characteristic of the Son. So Hebrews 1:8 reads, But of the Son, he says, your throne, O God, is forever and ever, and the righteous scepter is the scepter of your kingdom. You have loved righteousness and hated wickedness. Therefore, God, your God, has anointed you. Okay, so that's a really interesting connection. Now, notice that it's not in the psalm itself, because, of course, the psalmist didn't know that the New Testament was on its way. In this more sort of celebratory thing, we have that one strong statement about the throne of God that's going to last in perpetuity. Okay, so this forever and ever idea is la'olam, an idea of perpetuity. Okay, we tend to think of forever in a really almost a different kind of way, as something way out there. But when we get le'olam in Hebrew, it's more like a perpetual. Your throne is going to keep on lasting, keep on lasting, keep on lasting. So it would take you the same place, but in a slightly different conceptualization. So when we're reading these Psalms, here's a challenge for you, and two topics I want to bring up in future discussions. Number one is the idea of how does the Psalm relate to Christ? Okay, if these were written 1,000 years before Christ, how then do they relate to him in particular as far as being messianic? And then the other question is, how can a psalm be prophetic? Okay, so sometimes we'll hit one of these royal psalms like 110 and people go, that's a prophecy of Jesus. Well, was it a prophecy of Jesus, or was it a prophecy of a king that later became applicable to who we know Jesus to be? This is the challenge of interpreting in a Christian environment, and I think it's an interesting one, and some of you are really rising to the occasion and taking some time out to look at these as being ancient Near Eastern poetry in the Jewish setting that they're in, the original Israelite setting. And I would really encourage all of you to take that time with the Psalms before proceeding into pulling it into New Testament context, because that does honor the fact that these are pieces of text that are shared between the Jewish community and the Christian community. So despite our differences about who we might see that king as being, the hopefulness that's here in this psalm that there will be a king is, I think, something really worthwhile looking at. In that whole idea of sort of messianic hope is something that our Jewish friends and neighbors don't see as having happened yet, whereas we do. So taking that time to sort of make yourself sort of separate that out for a little bit rather than pulling everything immediately to New Testament context is to honor the history of interpretation within the Bible itself. So for Jewish people, they talk about, even within the Hebrew Bible, inner biblical interpretation. And Michael Fishbane is somebody who talks a little bit about that, how original sorts of things will then get carried over into other later writings. Well, now we've taken the entire Old Testament at different times, gets brought into New Testament writing. So there's this kind of a rolling tradition that's happening. And some specific kinds of interpretation that are happening even in the New Testament. So the writer of Hebrews is one who is kind of reinterpreting, reapportioning this idea, and really applying it. The author of Hebrews applies it to Jesus Christ, and that's a really interesting book when you consider that Martin Luther almost didn't want that book in the Bible. That's a really interesting book to actually go, why didn't he want that book in the Bible? So as we're interpreting things, look for nuance, look for these kinds of things where different ideas are carried forward into what we would consider to be our frame of reference nowadays. So I'm encouraging you to sort of see how layered this whole thing can possibly be. Okay, we'll talk again on the next two Psalms in the next day or so. Thanks very much, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye now.